Can I paint something on your cars for tips?" The back room of the ironworks went quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and then a dozen of Brenton's hardest men burst out laughing. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She just stood there in the middle of all that noise. A woman in a paint-stained canvas coat who looked like the harbor rain had followed her inside. 27 years old, thin in the way that comes from skipping meals rather than choosing to. Her auburn hair pulled back in a knot that had given up hours ago. Her knuckles laced with the pale, thin scars a lifetime of broken glass leaves behind. Her eyes were the color of ash after a fire's gone cold, gray and quiet, and they moved across that room the way a person reads a page they've read before. Nobody had invited her. Nobody there knew her name. She'd asked to paint their cars, and to men who owned armored sedans worth more than most people's houses, that was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. She waited for them to finish. She'd learned a long time ago that noise burns itself out if you let it, and when the last of them had chuckled himself quiet, she didn't argue, and she didn't beg. She simply walked to the black sedan, parked in the garage bay, unrolled a strip of dark velvet across its hood, and set a single panel of stained glass against the windshield, so the low amber light of the bar poured straight through it. Color spilled across the paint, across the chrome, across the faces of men who'd stopped laughing, because up on the mezzanine, a glass of something dark forgotten in his hand, stood the man that car belonged to. Rafael Castellano, 34 years old, the man every soul in that building answered to, black hair going silver at the temples, still as stone. He was staring at the light on his own windshield like he'd seen a ghost. Because he had. That particular way of laying color into glass, that exact hand, belonged to one man, a craftsman who died in a workshop fire by the water 19 years before. A man Raphael's own family had spent 2 decades trying not to think about. He set his drink down very slowly. Then he came down the stairs. If this story moves you, and I think it's going to, do me a small favor before we go on. Hit that like button, share this with someone who believes the truth always finds its way home, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning. To a long bus ride across 3 states. A father who never came home, and a girl who came looking for the truth, with nothing but her hands and her father's eyes. Raphael came down 1 step at a time, unhurried, the way a man moves when he knows the entire room will wait for him, and when his foot touched the concrete floor, the men parted on both sides like water dividing around a stone. But he did not look at them, and he did not look at her yet either. He looked at the glass. The amber light passed through it and spilled across the glossy black hood in a band of color like blood and honey mixed together. And there was something in the way those fragments of color lay beside one another, the way a thin line of lead guided the light from darkness into brightness, and then let it sink again, that made his chest tighten to a rhythm he could not name. He knew this kind of light. Not in the way one knows something learned, but in the way the body remembers before the mind can understand, like a scent from childhood suddenly rushing back inside a strange room. Somewhere far away, on some afternoon long ago, light had once fallen exactly like this, and a little boy had once stood still and watched it. He pushed that memory aside, because this was not the time, and lifted his eyes to look at her for the first time. Cora stood still beneath that gaze, not turning away, not lowering her eyes, only letting him observe her in whatever way he needed to. He observed her for a long time, longer than courtesy allowed, but she was used to being weighed and measured by people, and she understood that the right silence could say more than any words. At last he said that she had made this, his voice deep and flat, not a question but a fact he was placing on the table to see whether she would pick it up. She answered yes. He said no one sold that kind of glass to a woman walking in the rain. No one sold it to her, she said. She cut it. She soldered it, piece by piece. He tilted his head very slightly. Where had she learned? There was a small silence, and in that silence, something in her eyes softened, like ashes being stirred to reveal embers beneath. Her father had taught her, she said. Raphael's expression did not change, but a new stillness entered him, the stillness of someone who has just heard footsteps in a house that should have been empty. He asked who her father was. She looked straight at him as she answered, because this was the sentence she had traveled 11 hours and 19 years to say in this exact place, before these exact men, Elias Whitfield. The name fell into the room like a stone dropped onto still water, and the silence that followed spread in rings, from one man to another, from one face to the next. At the corner of the bar, the dry sound of breaking glass rang out, and every eye turned toward Bruno Kessler, 66 years old, a man who had stood in this room longer than most of those present had been alive, staring down at the glass that had slipped from his hand without his even realizing he had let it fall. He did not bend to pick it up. He only looked at her, his face gone white, as though a door that had been locked tight for 20 years had just been blown open by a wind no one could see. Dario Ren, standing a few steps away with the calm bearing of a man who had witnessed every important upheaval of the family for 40 years, slowly straightened, and for the first time that evening, his eyes left Raphael and fixed on the thin girl in the paint-stained coat. No one laughed anymore. No one could even remember having laughed. That name had done what no threat could have done. It drained every trace of mockery from the room and replaced it with something heavier, older, something these men had buried so deeply they had thought they had forgotten it. Raphael stood motionless before the glass, and for one long moment, he was not the boss who held absolute sway over everyone in the room. He was only a man facing a name he had thought he would never have to hear again. His gaze moved from her face down to her hands, the scarred knuckles, the long fingers that had held a glass cutter all her life, then returned to her ash-colored eyes, and what he found there made him breathe out very slowly. Those were eyes he had seen in someone else, a very long time ago, on an afternoon flooded with colored light. Raphael said that Elias Whitfield had died 19 years ago, his voice so quiet the men farther away had to lean in to hear it. She did not blink. She said she knew. She was his daughter. And she had come here because she did not believe the story people told about how he died. Raphael did not answer at once, and Cora did not fill that silence with hurried words the way most people did when standing before a man like him. She let her sentence remain there between them, beside the glass still spilling color across the hood, and she waited. At last he told her to sit, nodding toward a long wooden table set against the wall, and the way the whole room immediately drew back to give them a pocket of privacy told her just how much weight that order carried. She sat. He sat across from her. Bruno pulled a chair closer but did not sit fully, only stood with one hand on its back as though his legs were no longer steady enough, and Dario stood behind Raphael, silent, his aged eyes never leaving her face. Raphael told her to speak. Cora laid both hands flat on the tabletop, a habit she had had since childhood whenever she needed to arrange things too large to say all at once. Then she began, her voice even and clear, not trembling, not dramatic, only the truth told in its proper order. Her father had died in a fire at his glass workshop by the water 19 years ago. She had been 8. She had not been at the workshop that night. She had been home with her mother, long since asleep. And the next morning her mother had sat down beside her bed and told her that her father was not coming home anymore. She paused for a beat, not because emotion had overwhelmed her, but because she wanted every word placed exactly where it belonged. People said it was an accident. The file was closed after a few months. No one found anything worth finding, or no one wanted to find it. And life went on as though a man who knew how to turn light into color had never existed. Raphael said nothing, but his finger tapped once against the table and then stopped, as though he too were holding something back. Cora went on, saying her mother had raised her alone through all the years that followed. She had kept very little of her father's, only a few boxes in the closet, and she never opened them in front of Cora. 3 years ago, her mother died of illness. Slowly, Cora stayed beside her until the end. And after she was gone, Cora opened those boxes, because by then there was no one left in the world she had to ask for permission. Something passed through her eyes when she said that. Not tears, but the quiet emptiness of someone so used to standing alone that she no longer remembered what it felt like to have someone standing beside her. In those boxes were her father's sketchbooks, his tools, a few small pieces of glass he had made by hand, pieces she had always thought were only decorations, beautiful colored fragments he had kept for no special reason. She had carried them with her for the past 3 years the way people carry an old photograph, and she had spent those 3 years relearning every line of his hand from those notebooks, until her own hands knew how to do what his had once done. She looked straight at Raphael. But there was one thing in those boxes she could not explain. A name, written in her father's handwriting, in a notebook he had hidden more carefully than all the others. The name Castellano. Beside it were a few words he had written for himself, saying that if anything happened, these were the people who could be trusted. Bruno softly closed his eyes. And over the past year, she said, her voice lowering, someone had started coming after her. First letters, then phone calls. A man she had never met wanted to buy, at any price, the last pieces of glass her father had left behind. Not as a collector. He did not care about the most beautiful pieces. He kept asking the same question again and again, what she still had, and where all of it was. Then, 3 weeks after the last call, her apartment was searched. She was not home at the time. They did not take money, did not take belongings. They searched only through her father's boxes and then left. She stopped, and this time she let the silence finish the rest of the story. Her father had left their name behind as a promise that this place was safe, so when there was no one else to turn to, she had taken a bus across 3 states to come here. She had not come to ask for money. She had come to ask what they knew about the night her father did not come home, and why, 19 years later, someone was still so afraid of what his hands had once created. Raphael looked at her for a very long while, then turned to Dario, and something wordless passed between the two men who had stood beside each other through every kind of storm. When he turned back to her, his voice had changed, lower, firmer, like a door had just closed behind her, before she had even realized it. He told her she was not going anywhere tonight. She would stay here, under his protection, and tomorrow morning, she would tell him the name of the man who had called her. The next morning, before asking her anything about the name, Raphael did something Cora had expected, because she understood that men like him did not believe in words. They believed in what they could hold in their hands. He led her through a hallway at the back of the building to a room filled with things a family like this had gathered across many decades. And there, leaning against the wall, was a large antique stained glass window, one corner of it shattered into a spider web of cracks, many pieces missing, the lead lines warped by time and impact. Raphael said it had belonged to his grandmother, and that was the first time he revealed anything private, even if only in a few words. No one in this city could repair it the way he wanted. 3 people had tried. All 3 had damaged it further. He folded his arms and said that she claimed her hands knew how to do what her father's hands had done, so prove it. Cora asked nothing more. She took off her paint-stained coat, draped it over the back of a chair, then stepped closer to the glass and did the first thing her father had taught her to do before he ever taught her to hold a cutter. She stood still and looked. She looked for a very long time, so long that one of the 2 men guarding the door began shifting impatiently from one foot to the other, but she did not touch anything. She tilted her head, letting the morning light from the small high window fall across the stained glass, and she read it. Read the way the old craftsman had thought. Read where intention ended and damage began. Read the order hidden beneath the appearance of chaos. Then she began to work. What happened over the next 2 hours was something the people present would later describe differently. And strangely enough, every version was true. Some said she worked quickly, her hands moving among the broken shards of glass with a certainty almost ruthless, without hesitation, without trying the same thing again and again. Others said she worked slowly, standing almost motionless for whole minutes at a time, only turning a small piece of glass in her hand beneath the light, tipping it this way and that until it agreed to reveal the exact color it needed to hold. Both were true. She was quick when the work required speed, and she stood perfectly motionless when the work required stillness, and she always seemed to know exactly when each was needed, without having to think. Some said she barely looked down at her hands while soldering, as though those hands worked independently of her eyes, knowing their path from somewhere deeper than consciousness. Others swore her gaze never left the glass for even a second. Both of those things were true too. She cut new pieces to replace the missing ones, ground their edges with small, even movements, bent the warped lead strips back into shape until they embraced the glass as if they had never been broken, and the scent of rosin and hot lead spread through the room, a scent that made Bruno Kessler, standing at the threshold, breathe in and not release it right away. He had stood there the whole time without saying a word, his old hands clasped tightly behind his back. But when Cora reached the part where she had to reconnect the center of the frame, when she bent over and began guiding the light through the lead line in exactly the way that made color flow from darkness into brightness, and then sink again, Bruno turned and walked out. He went into the hallway, leaned his back against the cold wall, and stood there alone for a very long time, because he had once seen another pair of hands do that exact thing in another workshop by the water, 19 years before, and that memory came crashing down on him without warning. When he came back in, his eyes were red, but he said nothing about it. He only stepped close to Raphael, stood beside him, and said in a hoarse voice that only Raphael and Cora could hear that Elias never made only one version for important things. He always made two. One for people to look at, beautiful, meant to be hung up, meant to make everyone marvel, and another, smaller one, meant to be read. The readable one always looked like a harmless decoration, a small piece of color no one would bother noticing, something he could place directly in front of everyone without anyone realizing it was hiding something. He looked at Cora, who was bent over the stained glass, completely absorbed in her work, and his voice lowered. Elias had once told him that the most beautiful thing was always the thing people least suspected. Raphael did not take his eyes off the girl's moving hands. He said quietly that Bruno was telling him there was a readable version somewhere out there. Bruno nodded slowly. He was saying that if Elias had died because of what he knew, then he had not taken it to the grave with him. He had left it behind. And he had left it behind in the only way that someone with hands exactly like his could read. Both men turned to look at Cora, and at that very moment, she set the final piece of glass into place, stepped back, and the morning light poured through the restored window, spilling across the floor in a brilliant carpet of color as though 19 years had never passed. Raphael stepped closer to the newly restored glass, slowly, the way a person approaches something he wants to touch, and fears will vanish if he does, and he bent down to look not at the colors, but at the lead lines, the seams, the places where Cora had joined the old to the new. He was not a glassworker, but he had grown up in a family that valued detail almost to the point of worship, and he knew how to look at the place where two pairs of hands met on the same work and read whether they were one. What he saw made his breath stop for half a beat. In the places where Cora had joined the old lead lines to the new, the solder was not smooth and flat the way people were taught in proper schools. She had left behind a very thin ridge, a slight curved flick at the end of each seam, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it, an extra stroke that served no technical purpose, simply the way those hands ended a movement, like the final flourish in a signature no one else could imitate. And Raphael had seen that little curved stroke before. He had seen it on his grandmother's window, on this very piece of glass, in the sections that had never broken, the sections made by the original craftsman 19 years earlier. The two curved strokes were so alike they could not be coincidence, could not be imitation, could not be something stolen by observation. They were the same hand, separated by 2 generations, the same fingerprint left in lead and light. Raphael straightened very slowly, and in that moment, something in him cracked, a small fracture running through the shell of stillness he had polished for years so no one could read him. He turned to Cora, and for the first time since she had entered this building, she saw that his face was no longer a mask. He said, his voice low and slightly hoarse, that her father had made this window. It was not a question. Cora looked at him, then at the glass, and then she understood, and in that understanding, there was both pain and a strange comfort. The little flick at the end of the lead line, she said. He called it a way for the work to know who it belonged to. He said anyone could copy a picture, but no one could copy the way your hand lets go of the work. She reached out and lightly touched one old seam, the part her father had made before she was born, and her finger stopped exactly where that curve lay. She said she had left it there without even thinking. Her hands did what his hands used to do. She could no longer control it. It belonged to her now. Bruno, standing behind them, turned his face away for the second time, and this time he did not bother to hide it. Raphael looked at her for a long time, the man whose very presence usually commanded silent obedience, now standing silent before a thin young woman who had just accidentally proven that the craftsman who had died 19 years ago was still alive in every seam she left behind. Then he turned to Dario, who had been standing still and observing from the beginning, and the two men exchanged a look Cora could not read, but she could feel its weight. Raphael turned back to her and said she would no longer stay in the guest room. She would remain in this building, under his roof, and his people would be with her every time she stepped outside. Whoever was looking for her father's glass would soon know where she was. And when he knew, Raphael wanted him to think very carefully before taking another step. He looked at the glass one last time, at the tiny curved stroke hidden in the light. She had come here to find the truth about her father, he said. She had just shown him that truth had never died. Now they were going to find the rest of it. The name was spoken the next morning in a small room above the building. A room Cora guessed was where Raphael discussed matters not meant for the ears of the crowd downstairs. There were only 4 people there. Him, Dario, Cora, and a woman in her 50s whom he introduced briefly as Nadia Frost, the woman who had overseen the family's ledgers and money flows since before many of the men sitting below had even grown up. Nadia had the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading numbers other people wanted hidden, and she looked at Cora not with curiosity, but with the cool assessment of an accountant waiting for data. Raphael told her to give them the name. Cora anchored herself with that familiar childhood gesture, pressing her palms against the wood, before she said Everett Blaine. If the name Elias Whitfield the night before had fallen into the room downstairs like a stone that sent ripples across still water, then this name fell into the small room in a completely different way. It did not carry grief or memory with it. It carried a chill, the kind of cold that made Dario's brow tighten slightly and made Nadia's hand stop in midair over the stack of papers she had been turning through. Raphael's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes hardened. Nadia asked if she was certain, and her voice had changed. Cora said she had kept every letter he sent. She had recorded every call. Everett Blaine. He had never named himself in the first calls, but the first letter had been printed on paper bearing the name of his company, and she had looked him up. 62 years old. Real estate, construction, and now charitable foundations, with his name attached to buildings. Nadia stood without another word, crossed to an old file cabinet in the corner, and began flipping through folders with the quickness of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She laid a redevelopment map of the old harbor district on the table, the kind of map only people with the right connections could get before it became public news. She said she knew this name, and her finger traced a colored strip across the map, a stretch of land running along the water. For the past 6 months, his name had been appearing everywhere in planning records. There was a harbor project, a large one, a complex, a marina, expensive buildings with ocean views. It had existed on paper for nearly 2 decades, dead from lack of funding, and because a few pieces of land refused to be sold. Then last year the city council approved it again. Suddenly there was money. Suddenly there was momentum. Suddenly every remaining parcel became a problem that needed to be solved quickly. Her finger stopped at a point near the center of the strip, a small parcel lying right in the middle of everything. And this, Nadia said, her voice lowering, was where Cora's father's glass workshop had once stood. The room went still. Cora looked at that small point on the map, the patch of land where her father had once turned light into color, where he had carried her on his shoulders amid the scent of rosin and hot lead, where on some afternoon she had been too young to clearly remember, and she felt something cold crawl down her spine. She said slowly that the workshop had burned 19 years ago, right around the time the project was first drawn up on paper. Nadia nodded. 19 years ago, Everett Blaine had not yet been a man whose name appeared on buildings. He had been a rising property developer, hungry, willing to do things that later, when he was rich, he would hire other people to hide for him. A strip of harbor land could turn him from a rising man into someone no one could reach. But a strip of land had value only when it was unbroken. If even one parcel in the middle refused to move, the whole dream collapsed. Raphael spoke then, and his voice was calm in a way that was frightening. And the craftsman who held the parcel in the middle refused to sell. Cora lifted her eyes to him. Her father had loved that workshop more than anything except her mother and her. He would never have sold it, not for any price. No one in the room said aloud what everyone was thinking, because it was not proven yet, only a shape slowly emerging from the dark. Nadia folded the map, though her hands moved more slowly than when she had opened it. She said there was one more thing Cora needed to know about Blaine. Men like him never did dirty work with their own hands twice. If he had sent someone to look for her father's glass, and if that person had searched Cora's apartment, she stopped. Cora had said she was not home that night. Cora answered that she had been at work. When she got home, the kitchen window had been forced open, and her father's boxes had been turned out across the floor. They had taken nothing. They had only searched. Nadia and Raphael exchanged a look, and in that look Cora read the thing she had dimly felt for the past year, but had not dared to name. Blaine was not looking for a keepsake. He was looking for something he knew was real, something dangerous enough to be hunted after 19 years, and he still had not found it. Cora said softly, almost to herself, that he was still looking, which meant the thing he feared was still out there. Her father had hidden it well enough that after 19 years, Blaine still had not been able to touch it. The news came just as night was falling, while Cora was sitting in the small room they had given her upstairs, and it arrived in the form of a hurried knock on the door and the voice of one of Raphael's men, tense and low, telling her she should come downstairs. She went down, and she found Raphael already standing in the rear garage bay. the place where she had spread the velvet over the hood the night before, and around him was a silent circle of men, staring down at something placed directly in front of the large doors of the ironworks. It was a piece of stained glass. Not hers, not her father's, but a strange one, medium-sized, about the size of a small window frame, and it had been deliberately smashed, cracks spreading out from a single point in the center, as though someone had taken a hammer and brought it down exactly at the heart. Whoever had done it had carefully laid it back in front of the door after breaking it, arranging the shattered pieces so they still held their original shape, so that the message did not lie in careless destruction, but in cold intention. There was no note, no words. There did not need to be. For those who knew how to read, a broken pane of glass left at the door of a girl who worked with glass said enough. Raphael stood looking at it for a long time, both hands in the pockets of his coat. His face returned to the stone stillness she had seen on the first night, but this time she understood him well enough to know that stillness was not calm. It was something he put on so no one could see what was moving beneath it. Cora stood beside him and said softly that he knew she was here now. Faster than Raphael had expected, he answered, his eyes still fixed on the glass. That meant Blaine either had someone watching this place, or someone inside had told him. Neither possibility was pleasant. He turned to one of the men and gave a series of short instructions, in a voice that allowed no questions. Double the guards at every entrance. Check the list again of everyone who had come in and out of the building over the past 3 days. And no one, absolutely no one, was to leave Cora alone for even 1 minute once she stepped outside these doors. Then he bent down, picked up a broken shard of glass, turned it under the garage lights, and Cora saw his jaw tighten. He said this was a reminder. Blaine had not meant to kill anyone with it. If that had been his purpose, he would not have left it intact enough in shape for them to look at. He wanted them afraid. He wanted her to see something she loved broken and understand for herself that next time it might be different. He set the shard down, straightened, and turned to look at her with something in his eyes she had not expected. Not pity, but a quiet recognition. But he had made a mistake by doing this, Raphael said. He had just told Raphael that he was afraid. People did not threaten what they did not consider dangerous. Everett Blaine had just revealed that whatever her father had hidden was dangerous enough to make him move after 19 years. That night, Cora could not sleep. She sat on the floor of her room, the dark velvet spread out before her, and she took each small piece of her father's glass out of the folds of cloth, lining them up beneath the lamp, those colored fragments she had always thought were only decorations. She looked at them for a long time, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked at them not as keepsakes, but as a question. Then she opened the notebook he had hidden most carefully, the one with the name Castellano, and turned to the final page, the page she had read hundreds of times until she knew it by heart, but had never truly understood. There, in her father's cramped, slanted handwriting, there was not a drawing, not a design. Only a few lines written for someone he trusted would come one day. The thing you make in silence will speak louder than anything you say aloud. The work is the truth. Protect the work. And when you cannot read it alone, remember that I never truly left you alone. I always make 2 versions. One to look at, one to understand. Cora read that far and stopped, and her eyes moved from the words to the small panes of glass laid in a row before her, the meaningless pieces of color she had carried with her for 3 years across every mile of the road, and a thought began to form at the edge of her mind, faint and still without clear shape, but real. Her father had told her there were 2 versions, and one of those versions, she thought, perhaps she had been holding in her hands all this time without knowing it. But that night, she did not understand it yet. Not yet. She only rolled up the velvet, held it against her chest as though holding something alive, and lay down listening to the footsteps of the guards echoing through the floor. And out there, somewhere in the city, a man who had waited 19 years was waiting one more night. She drifted into sleep without knowing when, and in that sleep, she returned to the place she always returned, whenever memory was allowed to lead the way, the workshop by the water, the afternoons flooded with colored light. She had been too small to remember most things clearly, only 4 or 5 years old in those fragments of memory, and they came to her not like scenes from a film, but like sensations printed into the body, the scent of rosin and lead, the sound of the glass cutter scratching out a high note and then falling silent, and above all, the light, the way afternoon light poured through the panes of glass her father hung by the window, and spilled across the cement floor in pools of color that moved slowly with the sun. She remembered sitting among those pools of color, holding out her tiny hands to catch them, watching her skin shift from red to purple to gold as she moved her fingers, and she remembered her father bending down beside her, his large hands stained at the knuckles, showing her that light had no color until it passed through something, that it was the glass itself that taught light what it could become. He spoke to her in his deep, slow voice, never speaking to her the way people speak to a child, always speaking as though she was fully capable of understanding, and she remembered the feeling of being trusted even more clearly than she remembered any of the words he said. Her mother later used to say that Cora had absorbed things she did not even know she was absorbing, that she would sit under her father's work table for hours, quietly arranging broken scraps of glass into shapes while he worked above her, and that sometimes he would pause only to look down and see what she was making, then smile to himself and return to his work. And among all those blurred pieces of memory, there was one afternoon that rose more clearly than the others, not exactly because of what had happened, but because of one small difference her child's mind had kept. That afternoon, a man came to the workshop, a man she did not know, and with him was a boy about 7 years older than she was, a boy with dark, quiet eyes, standing behind the grown man's legs with the look of a child used to staying silent in places where adults discussed serious things. The two men talked in the far corner, their voices low and grave, and her father brought the boy over to her, sat him down beside her among the glass scraps, as though giving him something to do while he waited. She did not remember whether the two of them said anything to each other. Perhaps they did not. But she remembered that they had quietly arranged pieces of glass side by side, that she handed him a blue piece, that he placed it beside a red one, and the evening light fell through them and printed a small streak of purple across the floor. And that dark-eyed boy had looked at that purple streak for a long time, as though he had never seen anything like it. Then the man called him. The boy stood and followed, and she never saw him again. And that memory sank to the bottom like every other childhood memory, kept without her understanding why. Cora woke before the sky was fully light, carrying the strange warmth of that dream still lingering in her chest, and she lay still for a while, letting it settle before the worries of the present returned to take its place. That morning, when she went downstairs, Dario was already sitting at the long table with a cup of coffee and the face of a man who had stayed awake all night weighing something. He waited for her to sit, then spoke slowly, like someone opening a drawer that had been locked for many years. He said there was a place she needed to know about. Her father, besides the workshop, had also rented a storage space, an old place by the docks, not far from there. He kept things there that he did not use every day. Reserve glass, documents, unfinished work. Dario turned the coffee cup in his hands without drinking. When her father died, the family had paid the rent on that storage space for 3 years, hoping one day someone would come to claim it. Then time passed, and they let it go. But the owner of the warehouse back then, an old man who had respected her father, had not let anyone touch it. He locked it, sealed it, and left it exactly as it was. Dario lifted his eyes to her, and in those old eyes there was something almost gentle. It was still there, Cora. It had been there for 19 years, and he thought it was time she opened it. The warehouse stood at the end of a row of old metal doors behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place where time gathered visibly, property that asked no questions and answered none. Raphael drove her there in the middle of the morning, with Bruno in the back seat and 2 other cars following at a discreet distance, because after the broken glass left outside the door, he would not let her go anywhere without a ring of men around her. The warehouse door bore the number 14, and the lock hanging from it had been there long enough for the metal to turn the exact color of the air around it, the color of things forgotten. Dario had the key. He had kept it since the day the old warehouse owner's daughter had called, and he had never used it. Cora looked at his face as he approached the door, the particular expression of a man about to open something he had tried to keep closed for years. The lock resisted for a while, then finally gave way, and Dario hauled the metal door upward, and it let out a long shriek that echoed through the empty row of storage bays. The smell reached Cora before her eyes could adjust to the darkness inside, and it nearly made her knees buckle. The smell of old glass, of lead, of rosin that had long since gone quiet, but had never truly vanished. It was the smell of her father's workshop, a smell she remembered with her body rather than her mind, a smell that had lived inside her for 19 years in a place deeper than memory, and now it poured out of the darkness as though her father had only stepped away for a moment and might return at any second. She stood at the threshold and breathed it in, and for one moment, she could not move. Raphael said softly beside her to take her time, and she realized he was standing close enough to catch her if her legs gave out, though he did not touch her. She stepped inside. Within was years of a working craftsman's life stacked and preserved, arranged according to the private logic of a man who knew exactly where everything belonged and trusted that he would come back. Piles of reference books, crates of material, upright wooden frames, and along the back wall, stored in flat racks, glass, dozens of panes in every size and color, covered in a thin layer of dust like snow. Cora moved through that space in the exact way her father had taught her to assess a collection. Not greedily, not quickly, reading the surface to gather information before touching anything. She recognized many of the panes from descriptions in his sketchbooks, studies, experiments, unfinished pieces. She followed the glass racks, her fingers brushing lightly along their edges, until she reached the fourth rack, and her hand stopped. There was one piece lying differently from all the rest. It was heavier, and instead of being stored bare like the others, it was wrapped carefully in 2 layers of oilcloth, darkened by the years, and tied with a cord knotted in a way that made her heart miss a beat when she saw it. A double knot. The knot her father always used to tie things he wanted to protect from moisture, things he considered important. The knot she had watched him make hundreds of times, with his large, color-stained hands. The knot she had learned to tie exactly the same way without having to think. She stood looking at it for a long time without touching it. Bruno asked from behind her what it was, his voice tense. Cora said she did not know yet, but she did know. Somewhere deeper than words, she already knew. She carefully moved the surrounding panes aside to make room, then lifted the carefully wrapped piece out of the rack. It was large, heavy with the true weight of glass in her hands, and when she stood it upright, she could feel through the oilcloth that this was not an experiment or an unfinished study. This was something her father had wrapped with those very hands, tied with that very knot, and hidden in the deepest, most private place he could imagine, waiting. She sat down on the warehouse floor, laid the panel flat before her, and began untying the cord with hands that were steady even though her heart was not. Raphael, Bruno, and Dario stood silently behind her, and all 4 of them held their breath together as the first layer of oilcloth was lifted away. The second layer of oilcloth fell away, and the panel lay bare on the warehouse floor, but in the dimness of the storage space it refused to say anything yet. Only a dark, silent sheet of glass, black lead lines crossing it like cracks in something that had hardened. Cora knew glass never spoke without light. She lifted her eyes, searching, and Raphael, understanding her without needing her to ask, stepped to the warehouse door and pushed it open as far as it would go, letting daylight pour straight in and fall across the panel. And the panel woke. The first thing it showed them was not beauty of color, but a scene, built in the solemn, heavy style Cora immediately recognized as her father's when he made his most serious works, the style that turned glass from decoration into the weight of testimony. At the center of the panel was a workshop, formed from dark pieces of colored glass, and she knew at once it was her father's workshop by the water, every line of it recorded from the memory of a man who knew by heart the place he loved. And before that workshop, he had placed 3 figures, not detailed portraits, not clear faces in this part, but 3 standing shapes, made distinct enough for the viewer to understand that these were 3 specific people, and not nameless shadows, one tall and straight, one solid and shorter, one slightly angled as though stepping back, and between them and the workshop, he had etched a door, closed, and on that door was a lock, made striking with a piece of glass brighter than anything around it, as though he wanted the eye to stop there. I had to stop there, had to understand that this door had been locked from the outside. Cora looked at that image for a long time, and she did not need anyone to explain what it meant. Her father, the man who turned light into color, had not drawn an accident. He had drawn an act. 3 people, a workshop, a door locked from the outside. Behind her, no one said a word, but she heard Bruno release one long, trembling breath. Cora said softly, almost to herself, because she needed to hear it aloud in order to believe it, that this was not something he had made and then lost in the fire. He had made it afterward. He had known something, had seen something, then come back here, back to this storage space, and carved all of it into glass, then wrapped it in 2 layers, and hidden it in the most secret place he knew. He had made it so it would not burn with him. He had made it so that one day it would still be here and speak. Raphael crouched beside her, his eyes moving across the panel with the focus of a man used to reading what others tried to hide. He said there was more, and his finger pointed, without touching, toward the border of the panel. Cora followed, and now that she knew to look, she saw them. Along the edge, woven into decorative patterns that at first glance seemed only ornamental, were numbers. They were hidden so skillfully that an ordinary glance would see only a beautiful strip of design, but once recognized, they could not be unseen. Long strings of numbers, small separate clusters, cut with the same precision he had given everything, and running along the main lead lines, hidden inside the very guiding structure of the panel, were words, tiny lines of text created by the way the glass pieces had been cut and fitted together, readable only if one knew how to tilt the head and let the light strike at the proper angle. Cora bent close, tilted her head by instinct, and began to read. Then she stopped, and a cold confusion rose through her. She said she could read it, but she couldn't read it, and she heard the frustration in her own voice. The numbers here, these lines of text, they were real. They meant something, but they were locked. Look at this. She pointed to one string of numbers along the border. This was not the true number. It had been scrambled, shifted according to some rule. Her father would never leave something dangerous exposed, so anyone who found it could read it. He had coded it. He had hidden the truth inside the truth. She sat upright, ran a hand over her face, and in that moment, the weight of what she had just understood pressed down on her. This was what Blaine was looking for. This was what was dangerous enough to make him hunt it for 19 years. Her father had carved the whole truth into this glass. Those 3 people, those numbers, all of it. She turned to Raphael, and in her eyes there was both horror and something almost like pride, but he had locked it, and he had taken the key somewhere else. Without the key, this glass showed them there had been a crime, but it could not tell them who, could not tell them how much, could not say enough for any court to listen. The warehouse sank into silence, with only the distant sound of water striking the docks, and 4 people stood around a piece of glass that had waited 19 years to speak, only to discover that it had spoken only halfway. They brought the panel back to the ironworks with the care of people transporting something both priceless and dangerous, wrapped again in the same 2 old layers of oilcloth, laid flat on the floor of the vehicle, and Cora sat beside it the whole way back, one hand resting on the fabric as though afraid it would vanish if she took her hand away. When they arrived, they set it upright in the small room upstairs, leaning it against a wooden frame before a large west-facing window, so the coming afternoon light would shine through it, and while they waited, Cora did what she had not been able to do at the warehouse for lack of light and time. She returned to the 3 figures at the center of the panel. At the warehouse, beneath that hurried daylight, she had seen the 3 standing shapes but had not yet seen their faces, because her father had made their faces from the most delicate, thinnest pieces of glass, pieces that would only reveal their details when light passed through them at exactly the right angle. Now, as the sun lowered and the afternoon light began to spill through the west-facing window, those faces slowly emerged, one line at a time, as though her father had calculated that they would only agree to appear at this particular hour of light. Cora held her breath as she watched them take shape. The first figure, tall and straight, had a face she had never seen before, a man with high cheekbones and eyes that, even through glass, carried something cold and calculating. The third figure, slightly angled as though stepping back, also bore a face unfamiliar to her, but it was the man in the middle whose face made her go still, because though he was much younger than she had imagined, though time had altered him, she still recognized him from a newspaper photograph, from a charity ceremony reported not long ago, from the header of a letter her mother had once received. She said softly that it was him, her finger stopping just short of the glass. Everett Blaine, nearly 20 years younger, but it was him. Her father had carved his face with absolute precision. She heard Dario draw in a breath behind her, and Bruno curse softly under his breath. But she did not take her eyes from the panel, because the afternoon light was still rising through it, and the final face, the face of the tall, upright man in the first position, was still slowly becoming clearer beneath the shifting light. And it was then, behind her, that she heard a sound she would remember forever, the sound of a man's breath stopping halfway. She turned. Raphael stood motionless before the panel, and his face, the face she had learned almost never revealed anything, was now ashen, as though every drop of blood had drained from it. He was not looking at Blaine. He was looking at the tall, straight man in the first position, the face that had just fully emerged in the afternoon light, and in his eyes was something Cora had never seen in him before, a quiet and complete collapse. She said his name, Raphael. He did not answer at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer the voice of the boss before whom the whole building bowed, but the voice of some little boy dragged backward into something he had spent his whole life trying not to look at directly. He said that was his father, Tomas Castellano. The room went so still that Cora could almost hear the light moving, if light could make sound. She looked at the face of the man in the glass, then at Raphael, and she began to understand something she had not suspected until that moment, a black thread running beneath the entire story. Behind them, Dario said slowly, his voice heavy as stone, that for 19 years, they had never spoken the name Whitfield in this building. Not because they had forgotten, because they had not dared to remember. He looked at Raphael with an old pain. Tomas had been there that night. He had died only a short time afterward. In an accident none of them had ever truly believed. And all these years, they had lived with a question no one dared to ask aloud, what the man they respected, the father Raphael worshipped, had done in front of that workshop that night. Raphael was still looking at his father's face in the glass, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse. He told Cora that her father had carved his father's face into the same glass as Everett Blaine, the same scene, the same locked door. He turned to her, and in his eyes now was the terror of a man about to face the thing he feared most. She had come here looking for the truth about her father. It seemed it was also the truth about his, and he was not sure he was ready to know it. Raphael spent that entire night alone with the panel, and no one in the building dared disturb him, because everyone understood that a man facing his father's face in a scene like that needed to be left alone with his own ghosts. But by morning, when Cora came downstairs, she saw that he had returned, not like a man who had slept, but like a man who had walked through a long night and come out on the other side of it with a decision. He told her without circling around it that they could not read this thing on their own. She was her father's daughter, and she could read the technique, but neither she nor he was someone a court would trust. He knew someone who could help, someone he trusted, and more importantly, someone even men like Blaine could not accuse of bias. That man arrived the following afternoon, and his name was Gerald Ashford. He was in his 60s, neat and precise, wearing a dark suit that looked deliberately out of place in this building, with silver-framed glasses and the careful eyes of a man who had spent his life reading everything, including people, before saying anything at all. Cora learned that he had once been a federal prosecutor, that he had retired from that work, but had never retired from the instinct to turn over every stone and see what lay beneath it. Raphael introduced them briefly, then stepped back so Ashford could work, and the first thing the lawyer did was stand before the panel for a very long time without speaking, only looking, exactly the way Cora had looked at Raphael's grandmother's window, and she understood at once that this was a man who knew how to read before he judged. He had not come alone. With him was a quiet woman whom he introduced as a stained glass expert, someone who worked with museums and courts when the age and origin of works like this needed to be determined, and she spent nearly 2 hours bent over the panel in the absolute concentrated silence of an expert doing the most serious part of her work. She examined every lead seam beneath a magnifying glass, lightly scraped a hidden point along the edge to take a tiny sample, tilted the panel to read the way light passed through the layers of colored enamel. When at last she straightened, she looked at Ashford through her glasses and spoke in the voice of someone who only stated what she could prove. She said the composition of the colored enamel matched the period, the oxidation of the lead, the way it had aged, all of it was consistent with a work made roughly 18 to 20 years ago. She would confirm it more firmly after laboratory analysis of the sample, but she was rarely wrong about this. She turned toward the panel and pointed to the words hidden in the lead lines. And most importantly, these messages were original, not added later. They were in the very structure of the work, in the way the glass had been cut and fitted. No one could have inserted them afterward without taking the entire panel apart and remaking it. Whoever made it had built the truth into it, not written it on top of it. Ashford nodded slowly, and for the first time he spoke, his voice calm and measured. So they had an authentic work, from the right period, made by Elias Whitfield's own hand, recording a scene he clearly wanted someone to read one day. That was not nothing. That was a great deal. Then he turned to Cora. and in his eyes was the honesty of a man who never gave anyone false hope. But he had to tell her the truth, because she deserved to hear it. A scene, no matter how precisely rendered, could still be called an artist's imagination by Blaine's lawyers. 3 figures could be called fiction, a locked door could be called metaphor. As long as those numbers remained encoded, as long as they could not read exactly what they said, which accounts, which dates, which amounts of money, all they had was a beautiful and deeply suggestive work of art. He removed his glasses, cleaned them, and looked at her without blinking. Suggestion did not convict anyone. They needed the key to unlock those numbers. Without it, Everett Blaine would stand in court and smile. Cora looked at the panel, at the locked strings of numbers running along the border, the numbers her father had deliberately scrambled so no accidental reader could understand them, and she felt that need pierce her like a needle. Somewhere, her father had hidden a key, and she had to find it. Ashford was not the kind of man who sat around waiting for a key to fall from the sky, and as soon as he left the building that evening, he began following the threads. A retired prosecutor still knew how to follow, and one of the first threads he pulled led to a name he read to Raphael over the phone the next morning. Walt Brennan, a retired fire department investigator, a man who had been present during the investigation into the glass workshop fire 19 years earlier, and who, according to an old colleague Ashford still kept in touch with, had never believed in the way that file had been closed. He drove 4 hours to come, a man in his 60s with shoulders already slightly stooped and the large hands of someone who had worked with them all his life. And when he entered the room where they were waiting for him, he brought with him an old cardboard box worn at the edges, which he set on the table with the care of a man putting down something he had carried on his back for far too long. Brennan said he had kept it in his garage for 19 years, and his voice was the voice of a man finally allowed to set a burden down. When a case closed in a way that left your gut uneasy, you kept a copy of your own. He had done that. He always did that. He opened the box, and inside were yellowed files, photographs, pages of notes in the neat handwriting of a man who had once treated his work as sacred. Cora sat across from him, both hands flat on the table, and listened. Brennan said there had been a witness that night, drawing out a sheet of paper softened by time, a parking lot attendant from a warehouse nearby. He had told Brennan that he saw the fire break out, and not long before that, he had seen a car parked outside the workshop, a dark, expensive car that did not belong in that neighborhood. He had seen several people going in and out, then the car left very quickly, before anyone had even called the fire department. Brennan placed the paper on the table. That statement had been in his initial report, and then, when the official file was closed, it was no longer there. Someone had removed it, not lost it, not misplaced it, removed it deliberately from the version of the file the public could see. The room went still. Raphael, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, shifted slightly forward. He said Brennan had kept his own copy. Brennan nodded and said he had kept his own copy. He always kept his own copy, and he had kept this too. He pulled out another page, with a string of characters written quickly in his hand. The parking lot attendant had not been able to read the full license plate, because it had been dark and the car had moved fast. But he remembered part of it, and he remembered the make of the car. Brennan had written it down. All these years, he had had no way to trace it. He was only an old, retired man with a box in his garage. But Raphael and Ashford did. He lifted his eyes to Raphael and Ashford. Ashford took the page, read the string of characters, then handed it to Nadia, who had been sitting silently in the corner throughout the meeting with her own stack of financial records. Nadia looked at the string, then began turning through the documents, and Cora saw the movement of her hands slow when she found what she needed, the slowing of a person who had touched something she had both hoped for and feared. Nadia finally said this partial plate and this model of car matched a vehicle once registered under the name of a company, not Everett Blaine's company. A shell company, a name on paper with no assets, no real activity, existing only to hold title to a few things people did not want connected to them directly. She looked up, but when she traced who controlled that company at the time, the path led back to one place, to Everett Blaine. No one said anything for a long while. Cora looked at the witness statement that had been removed from the file, the paper that had slept for 19 years in a cardboard box in a stranger's garage, and she felt the floor shift beneath her. Her father had not merely drawn 3 figures and a locked door. He had drawn the truth. And now, piece by piece, the world outside the glass was beginning to match what he had carved inside it. Cora said softly, almost to herself, that he had been right. Brennan looked at her, and in his tired eyes there was an unexpected tenderness. Her father, he said. He had not known him, but he had spent 19 years unable to forget a case that had not been his to forget. Now he thought he understood why. Some truths refused to lie still, no matter how deeply people tried to bury them. Everett Blaine did not wait long to answer, and his blow came not as a broken pane of glass left at the door, but as something far more subtle, something designed not to strike at property but at Cora herself. It began with an article, published on a city news site, under the byline of a writer whom Ashford would later identify as someone who often received quiet payments from men like Blaine. The article did not mention Blaine as an accused man. On the contrary, it painted him as a philanthropist being harassed, and painted Cora as a poor young woman, unemployed, without credentials, without standing, using a questionable work of art and her connection to notorious figures in the Harbor District to build baseless accusations against a man whose name appeared on the city's charitable buildings. It called her a grieving daughter, one with understandable but distorted motives, not qualified enough to tell the difference between her father's authentic work and her own imagination. 3 days after the article, Blaine's lawyers filed a civil lawsuit, claiming that the glass panel belonged to a trust agreement between Blaine and Elias Whitfield from 19 years earlier, and that ownership of it belonged to their client. It was a carefully calculated move, Ashford explained, not necessarily meant to win, but to slow things down, to complicate them, to create the impression that this was a legitimate dispute rather than a crime being exposed. Cora read the article on her phone, sitting in the small room with the panel leaning against the wall behind her, and she read it twice, and when she set the phone down, her hands did not shake. Raphael watched her from across the room. He said Blaine wanted her to react. He wanted her to speak publicly, to cry, to rage, to give him something he could use. Cora said she knew. She looked down at her hands, at the scarred knuckles, and something quiet and certain rose inside her. He was saying she was not qualified enough to distinguish her father's work from her own imagination. He was building his entire argument on the idea that she was not truly her father's daughter in the way that mattered most. She lifted her eyes to Raphael. She would not argue against that with words. Her father had taught her that the answer to a lie was never to shout louder. It was to make something truer. She called Ashford that same afternoon, and what she asked for made him fall silent for a moment on the other end of the line, before he said it was a smarter idea than any public statement he could have written. 2 days later, in a room inside the building, before the stained glass expert, 2 other independent specialists invited by Ashford, and a notary sitting quietly in the corner recording everything, Cora sat down at a work table and did the only thing she knew how to do better than anyone else in the room. She worked. She worked for 4 hours, and she made 2 pieces. The first was her own, bearing the style now beginning to form as hers alone, distinct and personal. But the second was a deliberate recreation, faithful down to the smallest detail, of her father's technique. The same choices in cutting and joining, the same way of leading light through the lead lines, the same tiny curved flick at the end of each soldered seam that the expert had recorded on the original panel. The 3 specialists spent the next 90 minutes bent over the 2 works, comparing, measuring, examining every lead seam, and when they finally looked up, their agreement left no room for doubt. The second piece did not merely show familiarity with Elias Whitfield's technique. It showed a structural understanding so deep it could only have come from years of direct teaching and devoted study. This was not copying. This was inheritance. One of the 3 experts, an older man, removed his glasses and looked at Cora for a long time before he spoke. He said a person could learn to imitate a style, but that final flick at the end of the lead line, the way her hand released the work, that could not be learned by looking. That only came when someone had held her hand and taught her, year after year, when she was still too small to remember. She was not recreating her father's work, dear girl. She carried it in her hands. Ashford, standing beside him with the notarized record in his hand, gave a small nod. Now Blaine could no longer say she did not know what she was looking at, he said quietly. This record proved she knew it better than anyone alive. Blaine had just lost the one weapon he thought was certain. While Cora was proving with her hands what Blaine wanted to deny, Nadia Frost had quietly gone in another direction, and she did what she did best. She followed the money. She began with the strip of harbor land, and with the fire at the glass workshop, and she asked herself one simple and dangerous question, that if Everett Blaine had done this once, Had it truly been the only time? It took her 3 days, working with an acquaintance at a nonprofit watchdog organization that specialized in tracking murky real estate money, and when she gathered everything together and walked into the room where Raphael, Cora, Ashford, and Dario were waiting, her face carried the look of someone who had just seen the shape of something far larger than any of them had imagined. Nadia said this was not the first time, and she laid a thick file on the table. And this was not only about Cora's father. She opened the file and began to tell them, not with emotion, but with cold facts, stacked one upon another until they became something impossible to deny. Over 17 years, she had found the same pattern repeating in 4 different areas in and around the city. Each time with a different project name, a different front company, a different shell, but underneath, the same mechanism. Her finger moved from page to page. A piece of land someone wanted to gather into one large block for development. One parcel, or a few parcels in the middle, owned by people who refused to sell. Usually working families, craftsmen, small shop owners, people for whom that land was their whole life and not a number on a balance sheet. Then, in a strangely convenient way, disaster struck those stubborn parcels. A fire, a flood, an incident that left the owners exhausted, frightened, or simply with nothing left to hold on to. And afterward, the land was sold for a pittance to a company that, if traced far enough, led back to the same place. She looked up. To Everett Blaine. The room went still. Cora looked at the file, and she realized that her father's story, the night she had always believed was her family's private tragedy, was only one piece in a pattern far larger and far more merciless. She asked softly how many families. Nadia looked at her, and for the first time in all the days Cora had known her, there was a crack in her professional coldness. In just the 4 districts she had been able to trace, and she believed there were more, dozens of families, people who had lost homes, shops, workshops. Some had left the city, some had never financially recovered, and in at least 2 cases besides Cora's father's, someone had died in those convenient disasters, though no one had ever been able to prove they had not been accidents. That number lay in the room like an object with real weight, and for a long while no one said anything. Cora thought of her father standing his ground on his parcel, not out of stubbornness, but out of love, and she thought of all the others who had stood their ground in the same way, craftsmen and small shop owners whose names she did not know, and she felt her private grief widen into something larger, a cold anger with purpose. She said this was no longer only about recovering the truth for one man, and her voice had changed. Ashford, standing at the head of the table, nodded slowly, and in his eyes was the light of a former prosecutor, seeing not merely a case, but a whole system. If they could prove this pattern, he said, then this was no longer a dispute over a piece of glass, no longer the word of one girl against the word of a philanthropist. It became a chain, and a chain was far harder to bury than a single incident. But he looked at the panel leaning against the wall, at the locked numbers running along its border. To tie it all together, to turn this pattern into something a court had to hear, they still needed whatever could unlock those numbers. They still needed her father's key. Cora looked at the panel, then down at the backpack at her feet, where the dark velvet roll lay still as it had lain still for 3 years, and a faint thought brushed the edge of her mind again, closer than before, but still not clear enough for her to grasp. The call came to Ashford's office on a Tuesday morning, and it came from a direction no one in the group had expected. Ashford called Raphael immediately afterward, and his voice, usually calm and measured, carried something different this time, a caution almost like held breath, as though he were carrying a cup filled to the brim and feared spilling it. He said someone had just contacted him, through a private attorney, very quietly. A man. He had not given Ashford his name at first, but his lawyer said his client had read the article about Blaine and the glass, and that he had something he wanted to say, about the night at the workshop, about what had really happened. Raphael was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. One of the 3, he said at last. Ashford said he believed so. Not Blaine, obviously. And not, he stopped, choosing his words carefully because he knew who was listening. Not the man in the middle. The other one. The 3rd man in the glass. That man agreed to meet, but only under the conditions of someone who had lived too long in fear to trust anything easily. A neutral location, attorneys from both sides present, a preliminary conversation to establish the scope before anything was officially recorded. And when Ashford finally received the name to pass along to them, he read it over the phone slowly, Theodore Vance. Nadia searched the name through the night, and what she found drew the portrait of a man who had spent 19 years disappearing without truly disappearing. Theodore Vance, 61 years old, had been a small contractor in the city at the time of the fire, a struggling businessman drowning in debt. Then, shortly after that period, he quietly left, changed where he lived, used a slightly different name in another state, and for 19 years he did nothing large enough to draw attention, committed no crime, caused no trouble, simply existed in a small and careful way, like a man carrying something too heavy to put down and too heavy to carry forever. When Nadia finished telling them, Cora said that he had not run because he was afraid of the law, and she stared into the distance as though trying to imagine a man she had never met. If he had only feared the law, he would have lived differently. He had run because of what he knew. He had held it for 19 years. Raphael looked at her and said she felt sorry for him. Cora was silent for a while before she answered. She did not know what she felt toward him. She said honestly. He had been there the night her father did not come home. He was one of the shadows in the glass. Part of her wanted to hate him, but another part. She stopped. A man willing to step out of 19 years of hiding, to accept every consequence, just so he could finally tell the truth, was not a man who had gone numb. He was a man whose own secret had eaten him from the inside until he would rather collapse than keep silent. As they prepared for the meeting, Ashford warned them not to expect too much, and not to underestimate it either. A witness like this, he said, if his testimony was true, and if it matched what the Glass and Brennan's records had already shown them, meant this was no longer only a civil dispute over ownership of a glass panel. This was what turned the entire matter into a criminal case. This was the living testimony of a man who had been there. He looked around the room, stopping at Cora. But a man who had been afraid for 19 years was a fragile man. If they pressed too hard, he could close up and vanish again. They needed to let him speak in his own way, at his own pace. Cora nodded, and inside her, beneath the cold anger she carried toward Blaine, something gentler stirred. Not forgiveness. She did not know whether she would ever be capable of that, but an almost painful curiosity to look into the face of a man who had carried a piece of her father all those years. The meeting took place one afternoon in a neutral conference room in a small city halfway between everywhere, neutral ground in the most literal sense, and Theodore Vance arrived a few minutes before them, already sitting at the end of the table when Cora, Raphael, and Ashford walked in. He was thin, his hair almost entirely gray, with the withdrawn posture of a man used to making himself as small as possible. And when he lifted his eyes to look at Cora, something in them broke open, a painful recognition. He said she had his eyes, and those were the first words he spoke, before even a greeting. He had seen the glass in the photograph his lawyer had shown him. Elias had carved his face into it. After 19 years, he had still captured every line of his face, without missing by so much as a hair. His voice trembled, then tried to steady itself. Elias had always been that precise. Even when he had only a few minutes, he could look at a person and remember them whole. Cora sat down across from him, her hands resting quietly on the surface in her usual quiet discipline, and said nothing, only let him speak, exactly as Ashford had told her to do. And Vance spoke, slowly at first, then with growing urgency, like something compressed under pressure for too long, finally finding a way out. He said he owed Blaine money, a great deal of money. His business was dying, and Blaine was the only man willing to lend to him when no one else would. But men like Blaine gave nothing for free. One day, Blaine called him in and said it was time for him to repay the debt, not with money, but with a task. Blaine said there was a stubborn craftsman refusing to sell a piece of land he needed, and that the craftsman had to be taught that stubbornness had a price. Blaine told him the job was simple. Just frighten him. Just scare him enough to make him sell. Vance stopped, his hands clasped together on the table until his knuckles went white. That night, 3 of them went to the workshop. He was told to watch the door, to keep Elias inside while the others spoke to him, frightened him. Just scare him. That was the word Blaine had used. Vance had believed that word because he needed to believe it. He had locked that door because he told himself there was nothing so terrible about locking a door, that in a little while he would open it again and it would all be over. His voice broke, but scare had not meant what he thought it meant. By the time he understood what was really happening, it was too late to make it different, and he had been too afraid to confess and too involved to walk away. The room went still, and Cora sat very quietly, keeping her face calm, though everything inside her was swaying, because she understood he was trying to say what he could not bring himself to say directly, and she did not force him to make it clearer, because some truths did not need to be drawn in detail to be heavy enough. But then Vance lifted his head, and he said something no one in the room had expected, something that made Raphael, standing silently by the wall, suddenly go rigid. Vance said there was one thing that had haunted him for 19 years, and he thought they needed to know it, especially because he knew who they were. He looked straight at Raphael. That night, while they were there, a fourth man unexpectedly intercepted them. Not part of the plan. A Castellano man, a tall, commanding man who arrived and saw what was happening, and he became angry in a way that made all three of them shrink back. He argued fiercely with Blaine's man. He said this was not the agreement, that this had gone too far, that he would not let it happen. Vance swallowed hard. He tried to stop them. He truly tried. Vance remembered him standing there, one man against Blaine's people, shouting that the door had to be opened. He lowered his head. He did not know what happened to that man afterward. He only knew that not long after, he heard the man had died. An accident, people said. But Vance had never believed it was an accident. The only man that night who had tried to do the right thing, and he was the next one gone. Raphael stood motionless, and Cora saw on his face the impact of 19 years of suspicion being overturned in only a few sentences. And in that silence, an entire burden of guilt carried by a whole family began to crack apart, revealing something underneath, something closer to light. On the night before the hearing, Cora did not sleep, and she did not try to sleep. She sat on the floor of the small room, the dark velvet spread before her as it had been on so many nights, and she took each small piece of her father's glass from the cloth, lining them up beneath the lamp. She had done this hundreds of times over the past 3 years, like a ritual, like a way of being near him, and she did it again tonight not because she expected to find anything, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind spun with what Vance had said, with Raphael's face, when he heard that his father had been the only man who tried to do the right thing. The small panes of glass lay there beneath the lamp, beautiful and silent fragments of color, and she looked at them for a long time. And once again that faint thought touched the edge of her mind, closer than ever, that her father had said he always made 2 versions, one to look at, one to understand. But that night she was too tired, too heavy-hearted, and the thought slipped away again before she could grasp it, and she rolled the velvet up, held it against her chest, and waited for morning. The preliminary hearing took place on a Thursday morning, and the lawyer Blaine had hired turned out to be a name that made even Ashford fall briefly silent when he heard it. A courtroom star, a man who had won cases that had seemed impossible to win, a man with a gift for turning complexity into doubt, and doubt into an escape route for his client. And he was very good. Cora sat beside Ashford and watched him work, and she understood at once that she was facing something entirely different. He did not deny that the glass was real. On the contrary, he embraced that truth and turned it into his own weapon. He told the judge, in a voice so warm and reasonable it was infuriating, that no one in that room doubted Elias Whitfield had been a talented artist. No one doubted he had made this beautiful piece of glass. What they questioned was the meaning the opposing side was trying to assign to it. Your Honor, this was the work of a man under terrible financial pressure, a man about to lose the land he loved, a man, by every description, obsessed, and obsessed people created art that reflected their obsessions. 3 figures? They could be anyone. A locked door? That was metaphor, symbol, the kind of thing any suffering artist might create. He lifted an enlarged image of the panel and pointed to the numbers along the border. And here, what the opposing side called financial evidence. Your Honor, he invited anyone in the room to read what those numbers said. Just one account, just one date, just one figure that could be verified. He let the question hang in the air, then smiled, calm and deadly. They could not, because no one could read them. They were encrypted, they said. But, Your Honor, a string of symbols no one could decode was, legally speaking, no different from decorative pattern. The opposing side was asking the court to condemn a respected citizen based on a picture and a series of marks they themselves admitted they could not read. That was not evidence. That was a beautiful story a grieving young woman needed to be true. Cora felt each word of his like a small stone thrown at the thing she had poured her whole heart into building. And worse than that, she saw the judge, a woman with the face of someone who had sat on this bench long enough not to be easily moved, nod very slightly, not in agreement, but in consideration. And in that slight nod, Cora read the cold truth, that the argument was working. Ashford stood and did what he could. He presented Brennan's testimony, the removed report, the license plate, Nadia's 17-year pattern, and all of it carried weight. All of it caught the judge's attention. But Blaine's lawyer, each time, skillfully separated one piece from the others, calling this inference, that coincidence, the other the word of an unreliable old witness after all these years, and little by little, he wore away the thread that tied everything together, until what had once been a complete picture began to look like a pile of scattered fragments. When the hearing recessed, Ashford sat down beside Cora, and he did not lie to her, because he had never lied to her. He said softly that they were losing this round. The lawyer was right on one fatal point. Until they could read those numbers, everything else could be called inference. They had everything except the one thing they needed most. Cora sat there, looking at her father's panel displayed in the middle of the room like an accusation no one could read, and she felt the bottom drop out beneath her, the feeling of having traveled 11 hours and 19 years to get here, only to stand one missing key away from the truth. That night, Cora brought the original panel back to the small room, because she could not bear the thought of leaving it in the courtroom like a prisoner, and she set it upright against the wall, then sat down on the floor across from it, with the dark velvet spread beside her, the last two things left of her father in the same room for the first time. She had no intention of finding anything. She was simply tired and defeated, and she performed the old ritual to comfort herself, taking each small piece of glass from the velvet and lining them up beneath the lamp. But tonight there was something different, something that had never existed in all the 3 years she had performed this ritual. And that difference was the large panel standing right in front of her, beneath the same light, from the same angle. And when she picked up the first small piece of glass, a colored fragment she had always believed was only a pretty decoration her father had left behind, and when she accidentally raised it to eye level so the lamplight passed through it, between her and the large panel, the tiny pattern inside that fragment suddenly overlapped one of the locked strings of numbers along the border of the panel, and something in her mind went still. She sat motionless, then she lifted the piece again, slowly, carefully, and looked through it at that exact string of numbers, and she saw what 19 years had never allowed her to see, because she had never had the large panel to compare it against. The pattern in the small piece of glass was not decoration. It was a grid, a mask, a decoding template. The lines inside it, the darker and lighter places, the clear spaces and clouded spaces, when laid over the locked number string on the large panel, immediately revealed which numbers were real and which were noise, which order had to be read and which order had to be ignored, like a key sliding into the exact lock it had been cut to fit. Cora stopped breathing. She lifted the second small pane, then the third, and she understood, all in one dizzying moment, that these were not a few random decorations. They were the set of keys. Each small piece corresponded to a string of numbers on the large panel. Each piece was a decoding template for one part of the truth, and her father had made them at the same time as the panel, 2 versions, exactly as he had written, one to look at and one to understand. Then he had separated them, hiding the large panel in the warehouse where no one would think to look, and sending the little set of keys home for her mother to keep in a box, harmless colored fragments no intruder would bother noticing. And she had carried them with her for 3 years, across every mile, through 11 hours on a bus crossing 3 states, laying them right in front of a room full of dangerous men on the very first night, never knowing that the thing she held was the very thing Everett Blaine had been hunting for 19 years. This was why he had never cared about the most beautiful pieces her father made. This was why he had only kept asking again and again what she still had and where all of it was. He knew that a decoding version existed somewhere, because a man like Elias Whitfield would never lock away a truth without leaving a way to open it. But he did not know what it looked like, did not know where it was, and never imagined it lay neatly inside a roll of velvet that the craftsman's daughter clutched to herself like a bundle of old photographs. Cora sat on the floor in the middle of the night, her hands trembling, and began to work. She raised each small piece of glass, placed it over the exact string of numbers it belonged to on the large panel, and each time a true sequence of numbers emerged from behind the noise. One account, then another account, a date, a sum of money so large she had to read it again to believe it. Transfers moving out of funds and projects into names she now knew how to trace. Piece by piece, the truth her father had locked away 19 years earlier, opened beneath her hands, the hands he had taught, the hands he had known would one day return to read this very thing. When dawn was near, Cora sat in the middle of a floor covered with the numbers she had written down, the large panel glowing in the first light of morning, the little key pieces lying beside it like stars that had just guided her home, and she understood that the balance had just shifted, not with a loud sound, but with the quietest thing in the world, light passing through glass. Cora called them all together that morning, and when Raphael, Ashford, Nadia, Dario, and Bruno entered the small room, they found her sitting on the floor with the panel glowing behind her and pages covered in numbers spread all around her, and they saw on her face something that had not been there the night before, absolute certainty. She told them about the key pieces, about the decoding set she had carried against herself for 3 years without knowing, and she read the numbers aloud to them, and as she read, Nadia began comparing them with her own files, and her face grew paler with every passing moment, because each number Cora read matched a money trail Nadia had traced. A shell account, a payment, a date. The panel no longer merely said that a crime had happened. Now it named that crime, showed how much had been paid and to whom. But when Cora came to the words hidden in the lead lines, the words she could now read fully for the first time with the key set in her hands, her voice slowed, and she lifted her eyes to Raphael, because this part was not about Blaine, this part was about his father. She said softly that his father was not among the names that had received money. She had read everything. Not a single dollar had flowed toward Tomas Castellano, not one payment. She looked down at the sentence her father had carved, then read it aloud, word by word, as though reading testimony from the far side of 19 years. Her father had written there that on that night, when everything was moving toward a point from which there could be no return, a Castellano man had arrived and had stood against all of them. He had written that the man placed himself between Elias and the others, that he had shouted for the door to be opened, that he had used his own body to buy Elias the minutes no one else was willing to give him. Her father had written that he was not certain he had survived because of it, but that if he had managed to hide this truth, then it was because of the minutes Tomas Castellano had won for him. The room went completely still. Cora looked straight at Raphael. Her father had carved his father's face into that glass not to accuse him. He had carved it there so no one could erase the truth that the only man who tried to do the right thing that night was Raphael's father. He had placed Raphael's father beside Blaine not to bind them to the same crime, but to separate them forever. One man locked the door. One man tried to open it. Bruno turned his face away, his shoulders trembling, and Dario, the man who had carried that question like stone for 19 years, sank softly into a chair as though his legs could no longer bear the weight that had just been lifted from him. And Raphael stood there, the man before whom an entire family bowed, the man who had grown up with a buried guilt that his father had touched something that could never be washed clean, and Cora watched 19 years of doubt leave him layer by layer, like thawing ice, leaving behind something so painful and so relieved that he had to close his eyes for a long while before he could find his voice again. When he opened them, he was no longer looking at the glass. He was looking at Ashford. Raphael said his testimony, about his father's role that night, about the fact that his family had been there. He would bring it to court, publicly, all of it. Ashford watched him carefully. He said Raphael understood what that meant. It would pull the Castellano name into the middle of this case. It would open questions about his family that he could not control the answers to. The reputation he had protected, the line he had drawn around himself for years, would no longer remain intact. Raphael said he knew, and he did not hesitate. All his life, people had taught him that protecting the Castellano name meant staying silent, burying things, never letting anything escape into the open. But he had just understood that all those years, he had been protecting the wrong thing. His father did not need to be hidden. His father needed to be spoken of. He had died trying to do the right thing, and Raphael's family had repaid him with 19 years of silence, letting him lie in the dark beside the very men he had fought against. He looked at Cora, and his voice softened. Her father had used the last work of his life to separate Raphael's father from those men. The least Raphael could do was stand up and say aloud what Elias had carved in silence. Cora looked at him, at the man who had just chosen to trade away the thing he had spent his whole life guarding in order to fulfill the final wish of a craftsman he had never truly known. And she understood that this was exactly what her father had believed would happen when he wrote that these were the people who could be trusted. He had not left the Castellano name behind as an accusation. He had left it behind as a promise. The hearing resumed 3 days later, and the woman who walked into the courtroom that morning was no longer the defeated girl who had left it the last time. Cora sat beside Ashford with a new stack of documents, the original panel displayed in the center of the room as before, but this time, set beside it on a separate stand, were the small pieces of glass, the key set, and a comparison chart she had made herself, showing which key opened which string of numbers, and which money trail in Nadia's files that decoded string matched. Blaine's star lawyer entered with the same composed confidence as before, and he began again with the exact argument that had almost won the last time, that those numbers could not be read, that no one could point to a single account, a single date, a single verifiable figure. And Ashford let him finish, let him hang that question in the air once more, and smile his calm smile. Then Ashford stood. He said the defendant claimed no one could read those numbers. Your Honor, last week that was true. This week it was not. He called Cora forward, and she stood before the judge and explained, in the plain language of a craftswoman rather than a lawyer, that her father never made only one version for important things, that he always made two, one to look at and one to understand, and that the version meant to understand, the decoding key set, had been in her hands for 19 years, in the form of glass pieces everyone had thought were decorations. She picked up one key piece, raised it before an enlarged image of the panel, and showed the entire courtroom how the pattern inside the small piece of glass fit perfectly over the locked number string, showing which digits were real and which were noise. And she read aloud the first true number, an account. Then Nadia was called, and she placed beside that number a financial document, a shell account, the same sequence, the same period of activity. Then the second number, a date, matching the day a large sum of money had been transferred. Then the third number, an amount of money, matching down to the last digit a payment Nadia had traced back to the shell company that Brennan's license plate evidence also led to. Piece by piece, the things Blaine's lawyer had so skillfully separated in the previous hearing were now joined together before the judge's eyes, and this time they could not be pulled apart, because each piece had now been soldered to the next by a specific, verifiable number that could not be dismissed as inference. Ashford let the numbers speak for themselves, then layered over them the testimony of Theodore Vance, the man who had been there that night, and the file Walt Brennan had kept for 19 years in his garage, the witness statement removed from the official record, and finally he laid out Nadia's 17-year pattern. 4 other districts, the same mechanism, the same working families pushed off their land. He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. He simply placed the truth on the table layer by layer until their combined weight became something no one in the room could pretend not to see. Blaine's lawyer rose to object, and he was still good, still tried to wear down each piece, but this time, whenever he pulled one piece away, the number beneath it remained there, bare and verifiable, and everyone in the room saw that, including him. No one noticed exactly when his calm smile disappeared. The judge, the woman with the face of someone who had sat on this bench long enough to tell the difference between a complicated case and a case someone had deliberately made complicated, looked down at the stack of documents before her for a long time before she spoke. She said she would allow the suit to proceed, and she would do more than that. The financial evidence presented today went far beyond the scope of a civil dispute over ownership of a work of art. She would refer the entire file to the State Attorney General's office for criminal review. This was not a ruling on guilt. This was an acknowledgement that what had been presented here today deserved serious investigation by the proper authorities. She looked toward the defense table and said she advised the defendant to prepare for that. Cora sat very still, both hands flat on the table, and she did not cheer, did not cry. She only looked at her father's panel glowing beneath the courtroom lights. The numbers he had locked away 19 years before now read aloud before a court, and she whispered to herself, too softly for anyone else to hear, that he had been right, that the work was the truth, and that she had protected it. The Attorney General's office moved faster than anyone in the group had dared to hope, and Ashford later explained why, that the file they had submitted was not a beginning from nothing, but a case almost already built, decoded numbers, a living witness, an old investigation file restored, and a pattern stretching across 17 years. The state investigators only had to pull the threads Nadia and Brennan had already placed in their hands, and every thread they pulled led to another. Accounts, shell companies, payments that now, with Elias Whitfield's key, could no longer hide. Everett Blaine was arrested on a Wednesday morning, and the news came to Cora not like an explosion, but like a sudden stillness, the stillness of something that had been stretched tight for 19 years, finally loosening. Ashford called her at 7 o'clock in the morning, with the calm of a man who had done this work for 30 years, but could still feel the weight of a moment like that. And he told her this was not the end, that between an arrest warrant and a conviction, there was still a long road, and she said she understood, and she truly did. But she also understood that something had changed forever, that the man who had once called her mother in that sweet, oily voice, the man who had ordered a broken pane of glass placed at the door, so Cora would know fear, the man who had waited 19 years believing the truth had died with her father, now had to stand for the first time on the other side of a door he himself could not open. She was present in court on the day Blaine appeared, not because she needed to see him in handcuffs, but because she felt she owed her father one thing: to be there, to let his panel be placed in the same room as the man it had accused, so that the truth and the man who had tried to bury it could finally stand beneath the same roof. The panel was displayed there as evidence, glowing beneath the courtroom lights, the 3 figures and the locked door and the numbers now read aloud. Blaine walked in between the court officers, and he still tried to maintain the bearing he had built over so many years, chin lifted, steps even, the face of a man who had passed through difficult rooms before, and believed he would pass through this one too. He did not look at Cora. He did not look at Raphael, who sat silently in the back row with Dario beside him. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, the mask of composure that men like him wore when the ground began shifting beneath their feet. But when he passed the place where the panel was displayed, in a moment perhaps even he could not control, his gaze slipped sideways and touched the glass. Only half a second, but Cora had her father's eyes trained to read what people tried to hide, and in that half-second she saw clearly what the calm mask could not conceal. Not composure, not contempt, fear, the naked, old fear of a man who had just looked directly at the thing he had spent 19 years believing had vanished, only to discover that it had never vanished at all. It had only waited, patient and silent, in a warehouse by the water, until someone with the right eyes and the right hands returned to read it. Then he passed by, and the moment closed, and Cora breathed out very slowly, feeling something that had been clenched tight in her chest for weeks finally let go. Ashford said softly beside her that it was not over yet, repeating what he had told her before. Cora answered that she knew, her eyes still fixed on her father's panel. But now it was different. Blaine knew they saw him, and more importantly, he knew her father had seen him, 19 years ago, and had never stopped seeing him. In the weeks that followed, time at the ironworks changed its rhythm, slowing, stretching, like a breath held too long finally being released. The case was now in the hands of the Attorney General's office, and though there was still a long road ahead, the burden of proving it no longer rested on Cora's shoulders, and for the first time in weeks she found she could sit still, without having to arrange something in her mind. One late afternoon, she sat alone in the small room with her father's panel, letting the last light of the day pass through it as she often did, and Raphael knocked on the door. He rarely came to her without a reason, and she knew at once that something was different in the way he carried himself, a hesitation that did not belong to the man whose authority was unchallenged in these walls. He sat in the only chair in the room, and for a while he only looked at the panel, at the workshop her father had carved, at the pools of colored light spilling onto the floor through it. At last he said he had been thinking about something. Ever since the night she opened the warehouse, and he saw that workshop in the glass, there had been something about it that kept pulling him back, and only in these past few weeks had he understood why. He turned to look at her. When he was a child, his father had once taken him along to a place. He did not remember it clearly. He had only been about 11 or 12. He remembered it was a workshop by the water. He remembered its smell, the smell he had breathed in again for the first time after so many years when they opened the warehouse. And he remembered the light passing through glass and spilling onto the floor as color, something he had never seen before and never forgot afterward. Cora sat very still, and something began to rise in her chest, vague at first, then clearer with every passing moment. Raphael went on, his voice slowing as though he were feeling his way step by step through a fragile memory. His father had come there to commission a stained glass window for his grandmother, speaking with a man in the corner of the workshop about the design. While the adults discussed the work, that man, the owner of the workshop, had brought him to a corner where a little girl was sitting among broken scraps of glass. He had set Raphael down beside her so he would have something to do while the adults talked. He stopped, and when he continued, his voice was quieter. The little girl had handed him a blue piece of glass. He had placed it beside a red one, and the afternoon light had fallen through them, printing a small purple streak across the floor. He had never seen anything like it. He had stared at that purple streak for a long time. Cora did not breathe. The memory from her dream that night, the dark-eyed boy, the blue piece of glass she had handed him, the red piece he had set down, the purple mark on the cement floor, all of it came alive at once and fit into his words like a key entering its own lock. She said it was him, her voice so soft it was almost not sound. The dark-eyed boy. It was him. Raphael looked at her, and on his face, the face she had learned almost never revealed anything, there was now something strangely bare and gentle. He said her father had placed the two of them side by side among the broken glass on that peaceful afternoon, years before everything went wrong, and long before his father had to return to that same workshop on a fateful night to try to stop something he could not stop. They had arranged glass together once, very long before any of this had happened, before both of them lost their fathers. They sat in silence for a long while, and neither said anything more, because there was no need. There was no declaration of love, no gesture crossing the space between the two chairs. There were only two people, each of them once a child sitting among broken pieces of glass on the same afternoon, now sitting together again on the far side of 19 years, beneath the same kind of light passing through the same kind of glass, understanding that the road that had led them here had begun longer ago than either of them had ever known. The afternoon light shifted across the floor, a slow pool of color drifting through the space between them, and Cora looked at it, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not see loss in that light, but something beginning. The idea came from Cora, but it was Raphael who made it real, and later, when they looked back, none of them could clearly remember where it had begun, only that once it was spoken aloud, it had the inevitability of something that should have happened long ago. The strip of harbor land Everett Blaine had spent nearly 2 decades, and one murder trying to assemble, was now suspended in legal uncertainty, as investigators reviewed every transaction, and in the middle of that strip, the parcel where Elias Whitfield's glass workshop had once stood, the parcel her father had died rather than sell, returned to Cora's hands as something that should always have belonged to her. She could have sold it. With that location, even after Blaine's project collapsed, it was worth enough money that a girl who had once skipped meals because she was short on cash would never have had to worry about money again. She did not sell it. Instead, she stood on that empty piece of land one morning, with Raphael beside her, and Bruno, Dario, and Nadia behind them, and she said what she wanted to do, and Raphael only nodded once, then began moving the resources a family like his possessed to turn an empty parcel into something. They rebuilt a workshop, not as a memorial in the cold way of a plaque, but as a real workshop, alive, with a roof to hold off the sun and large windows to welcome the light. Long work tables, racks of glass in every color, new tools arranged neatly and waiting for hands that did not yet know how to use them. And it was not meant for people who already had everything. Cora set only one condition, that the place would be free, and that it would be meant first for teenagers who had grown up the way she had grown up, the children of working families in the harbor district, children no one had ever thought to teach a beautiful craft, children the world had long ago decided had no share in delicate things. Nadia, who had spent her whole life reading the numbers people wanted hidden, now built a fund transparent down to the last dollar to sustain the place, and she did it with a devotion that made Cora understand that for Nadia, this too was a way of atoning for something. Bruno, who had once watched Elias work for so many years, volunteered to come several times a week, not to teach technique, because his hands were no longer steady enough, but to tell stories, so those children would know that the craft they were learning had not been born yesterday, that it had a current, a bloodline, people who had lived and died for it. Dario, the man who had carried a question heavy as stone for 19 years, came on opening day and stood silently in one corner for a long time, watching morning light pour through the new windows and spill across the workshop floor in pools of color, and Cora saw him lift a hand to rub his eyes once, then turn away. The children came, hesitant at first, suspicious in the way children become when they have learned too early that beautiful things usually have a hidden price somewhere. But Cora sat down beside them, among the broken scraps of glass, exactly as her father had once sat beside her, and she did not speak to them the way people speak to children. She spoke as though they were fully capable of understanding, because she remembered the feeling of being trusted more clearly than she remembered anything else from her childhood. She showed a boy how light had no color until it passed through something, that it was the glass itself that taught light what it could become. And when the boy tilted the piece of glass in his hand and watched its color spill over his skin for the first time, his face lit up in a way Cora knew well, the way a child's face changes when he has just discovered that the world is wider than he thought. And she had to turn away for a moment, because in that instant, the boy was not the boy, but her, more than 2 decades earlier, beneath the hands of a man who had taught her that the most beautiful thing was always the thing people least suspected. The memorial took place on a late autumn afternoon, 3 months after the workshop opened, and it was nothing like the kind of memorial people usually imagine, with no cold solemnity, no long speeches. It was more like a gathering of people whose lives had been woven together by a thread they would only see much later. More people came than Cora had expected. There were members of the Castellano family, Ashford and Brennan too, who had driven 4 hours once again to be there, Nadia and Dario and Bruno, and even families from the other districts Nadia had traced in the 17-year pattern. People who had lost homes, shops, loved ones in convenient disasters, now coming to stand in the same place with others who had endured the same thing. And in their presence there was something close to healing. And there were the children of the workshop, teenagers who had become less hesitant now, standing in a small group with hands that had begun to bear the first calluses of the craft. In the center of the workshop's west wall, where the afternoon light would strike strongest, stood an enormous stained glass window, nearly as tall as the wall itself, covered with a black cloth. Cora had worked on it for 3 months. Every evening after the children had gone home, alone with the work in the exact way her father had taught her to be alone with the work, and no one had been allowed to see it until today. She stood before it, and she had prepared no speech, because she knew she would not be able to speak if she tried. She only looked once around the crowd, paused on Raphael, then lifted her hand and pulled the black cloth down. The crowd fell silent, and in that moment, as though the sky itself had conspired with her father about timing, the late afternoon sun angled down at exactly the right slant and poured through the glass, and the window woke, casting color across the entire workshop and over the faces of everyone standing inside it. It was larger than anything Cora had ever made, and it did not tell of a crime, did not hide a number, did not lock away any truth. This time, she hid nothing. In the lower part of the glass, a man with large hands held the hand of a little girl with reddish-brown hair, the two of them walking among pools of colored light, and anyone who looked would immediately understand that they were a father and his daughter. A little higher, along the length of the glass, that little girl grew older from one panel to the next, until she became a young woman standing beside the man, both of them bending over a pane of glass, 4 hands doing one piece of work together, and the light passing through that place burned brighter than anywhere else. And in one corner, farther away, smaller, almost something one had to know to look for before seeing it, was a boy with dark eyes sitting among broken scraps of glass, a blue piece in his hand, a red piece on the floor, and a small purple streak where the light from the 2 pieces met. Cora heard Raphael, somewhere behind her, draw in a soft breath, and above everything, running across the top of the window, made from the brightest pieces of glass she could find, not in dark lead like the hidden lines her father had once concealed, but in light itself, were 4 words, large enough that no one had to strain to see them, clear enough that they could never again be encoded or buried. Light outlives the darkness. There was no final punctuation, no explanation, only that truth spoken simply, in the way simple and true things endure through everything. The crowd stood silent for a very long time. Not the silence of people who did not know what to say, but the silence of people who had just been given something that needed a moment to be received properly. Bruno lifted a hand to cover his mouth and looked upward. One of the workshop children, a boy, softly asked the person beside him how she had made light turn into words like that, and no one answered, because the answer was the whole story. And Cora stood among the pools of color falling from her own work, beneath the 4 words made of light, and thought of the father who had taught her that the work was the truth, and she knew, with more certainty than she had ever known anything, that he was here, in every shard of color, in every pool of light, in her hands and her eyes, and in the small purple streak where 2 children had once sat beside each other so long ago. When the crowd began to break apart into small groups of conversation, when the afternoon light had lowered even further, and the pools of color on the workshop floor slowly stretched longer, Dario came to stand beside Cora, the old man who had carried a question heavy as stone for 19 years, and he looked at the enormous stained glass window for a long while before he spoke. He said she had come to them on a rainy night, with a roll of velvet and a question she had traveled 19 years to ask. She had come to find the truth about her father. He turned to look at her, and in those old eyes there was a gentleness she had not seen on that first night. Had she found it? Cora looked at the glass, at the father holding the hand of the little girl with reddish-brown hair, at the girl growing older until she stood carving glass beside him, at the dark-eyed boy in the far corner, at the 4 words made of light running across the top, and she was silent for a while, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was choosing how much of it to say. At last she said she had found more than an answer. She had come to know what had happened to her father. But what she found was not only what had happened. She found what he had been trying to tell her all these years, that what we build quietly, with love and honesty, will outlast all the people who try to bury it. He had not left her an accusation. He had left her a way to see the world. Raphael stood silently behind her, saying nothing, only looking at her the way a person looks at something he had almost never found. And Cora turned back to the glass, lifting her hand to touch lightly a piece of color where the light passed through brightest. Her father had carved truth into everything he touched, into every lead line, every fragment of color, every small curved flick at the end of each soldered seam that her own hands now made again without thinking. And he had locked one truth carefully enough that it could wait 19 years, but he had also trusted enough to leave a key, because he knew that light never knew how to lie still in darkness, that sooner or later it would find a pane of glass to pass through, a pair of hands to read it, a road back home. And if this story has touched your heart in any way, if it reminds you that truth, kindness, and the things we make with our whole soul always have more lasting life than we imagine, then please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories to more people every day. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. How do you feel about Cora's story and her journey to find the light, and which part touched you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because every word you write is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for listening until the very final moments. May you, the person watching this video, always have very good health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.